Hello. So today we're going to look at chapter 3, which focuses on Zeus and Hera. Now, one of the things about Maurizio in these first chapters 2 through 8, she'll look at two or more gods in each chapter. But other than her introductory remarks where she talks about the two gods or more gods in some chapters, there's one god that's the focus of that chapter. So we're going to get a lot on Zeus. We're not going to get as much on Hera. So just want you to know that going in. Now, what she has to say about Hera and about the Zeus and Hera is interesting. So it seems earlier, maybe before the Indo-Europeans invade. So just one brief thing on the Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans started from somewhere on the eastern side of the Black Sea, so the Caucasus Mountains, and then they spread out into India and then also into Asia and Europe. And they gave birth to the Indo-European languages, which include English and all the modern languages of Europe. For the most part, they're Finnish, Hungarian, Estonian are not Indo-European languages. They come from some other source. But the Indo-European languages are all related. They go back to a common ancestor. The Indo-Europeans were a warrior people. They were nomadic. And so they traveled around and they worshipped a male sky god. So prior to the Indo-European invasion, it seems likely that goddess worship was at least on a par with god worship, maybe even more so. So we don't know that for sure, but there is some evidence to support that idea. So one of the things that we're going to see a bunch on is Zeus's love affairs, and the love affair of Leda and the swan. That will be the focus for the Nachleben, the final section of chapter 3. Where we'll look at two modern poems, one by Hilda Doolittle, H.D., and the other by William Butler Yeats. So they take two very different approaches to that particular event. Hilda Doolittle sees it as a sort of sensuous seduction, whereas William Butler Yeats sees it more as a rape. Because you do have the situation where you've got Zeus taking the form of a swan to get close to Leda, who is the queen of Sparta, and then he has his way with her. And in some versions in the ancient accounts, that is a forceful, so it's basically a rape. In others, it's more consensual, but it does raise the question, if you've got a god having sex with a mortal, is it ever truly consensual? Because the god has power, and in those power relations, if they're not really equal, then you do have this situation where the powerful person may be demanding sexual favors that are not really offered, and so it's always a bit dicey. But Zeus had lots of love affairs, and he changed himself into various objects and animals to get close to these women. And then many of those women then gave birth to figures who were heroes. In the case of Leda, Leda gave birth to two semi-divine children. Those would be Polydeuces and Helen. And then she also gave birth to two mortal children, Clytemnestra and Castor. And the mortal children were the children of Leda and Tyndareus, her husband, the king of Sparta. And the semi-divine children were the children of Leda and Zeus. A lot of focus in the opening part is going to talk about Zeus as a king. And there are varying ways that Zeus is looked at as a king. In the Iliad, Zeus is, for the most part, every now and then he makes some threats. He makes some threats against Hera in Book 1 that we'll see when we get to chapter 10, the section from the Iliad. We'll actually have Zeus make a pretty clear threat to Hera that she needs to back off or else he'll make her do so. So there's definitely a threat of physical violence there. But for the most part in the Iliad, Zeus is fairly level-headed. The other gods are all getting involved in various things, and Zeus tries to sort of keep things on an even keel. In later authors, that'll be even more the case. So Zeus becomes sort of the representative of order and keeping things in order. We don't always see him that way. Sometimes Zeus is presented as a powerful figure, and powerful figures sometimes can be tyrannical. So that changes over time. Zeus early on is rougher than Zeus is later. And actually, in the Old Testament, God is often harsher in the early books, and then he sort of mellows out in later books, or becomes more distant, so that he's less involved in human things, at least directly. The main literary work for chapter 3 is a selection from the Prometheus Bound. It's actually two selections from the Prometheus Bound, which is a play attributed to Aeschylus. I say attributed to Aeschylus. The book will actually say it's by Aeschylus, but there is scholarly disagreement on this. There have been word studies done and language study, grammar study sort of on the play and the language that's used there that cast doubt on this being actually by Aeschylus. It doesn't quite match up with the 6 plays that we have that are by Aeschylus. It is possible that it is by Aeschylus' son or even his grandson, who also wrote plays. We don't know, but it was attributed to Aeschylus. So some people will say Aeschylus. I will generally say the author of the Prometheus Bound when I talk about the author, because partly because I think Aeschylus did not write the play, but also because, in a sense, it doesn't matter. We have the play. So the Prometheus Bound is a play, is a tragedy. Tragedies were composed in the 5th century in Athens, so the 400s in Athens. Athens was the only place in the 5th century doing tragedy or comedy for that matter. So they developed drama. It developed in Athens. And that might be because Athens was a democracy, and democracies are work on dialogue. Right? People come up with different ideas in assemblies, and then there's a vote, and then one guy wins and the other guy loses, and that sort of thing, right? That's how democracy is supposed to work, right? That you have this debate of different positions. Well, that's what you've got in drama, right? You don't have a story told by an omniscient narrator. You have it enacted in front of you with different characters espousing different points of view. So, we don't know the exact date of the play, partly because we don't know if it's by Aeschylus. If it is by Aeschylus, it has to be before 456 when Aeschylus dies. And that's a bit of a problem. Again, the language seems to suggest it's probably later than that, which makes it, again, unlikely that Aeschylus is the writer. It seems to be a play that is part of a trilogy, which does fit Aeschylus, but also could fit his son Euphorion. Greek tragedians had to produce 3 plays for the city Dionysia. So there were 3 tragedies and then also a satyr play, which was like a comic version of mythology, as a 4th play, as sort of a palate cleanser, if you will. So you'd have 3 tragedies, and those could get pretty heavy, and then you'd have this light play at the end to lighten the mood, before people went into the next day of watching 3 more tragedies and a satyr play. And there were 3 days of that. And then the final day was 5 comedies. So the whole point was you don't want to end on a bad note, so they would have the comedy stuff. The play ends at a non-ending spot. I mean, the play has an ending like the ending of Empire Strikes Back, which clearly cannot be the actual ending, right? I mean, if all you had of the Star Wars movies was Empire Strikes Back, you would know something had to come before it because they're in this situation, but which isn't fully explained, but the audience presumably knows what it is, and then it ends on this weird thing where, what's going to happen now, right? We don't have a clear ending. And this play has that sort of feature. At least the ending is sort of unclear. But the premise is as follows. Prometheus has stolen fire from the gods, has given it to mortals because he knows that mortals will die without the fire, and he is a defender of mortals. He knows this Prometheus is actually super smart and can see the future, so he actually knows what's going to happen if he gives them fire. He knows he's going to be captured. He knows he's going to be chained to a rock. He knows all that stuff, but he does it anyways. So this is a much more heroic Prometheus who does things on behalf of humanity. And he's also the teacher of humanity, right? He taught humans like herbal medicine, and he taught them other things that have helped them survive. So he's very much on the side of humanity against Zeus. Zeus, who does not appear in the play at all, but comes across very much as a tyrant. He is going to have his way no matter who he has to, torture, or no matter what he has to do. So there is a cruelty to Zeus and to his minion Power, who does have a part in the play. The other characters in the play all seem to be a little bit leery of the hard line that Zeus is taking. So the likelihood is that my reading is this is the middle play of a trilogy. The first play, I would argue, is probably the play that is called Prometheus the Firebringer. In other words, we have the actual theft of fire, and that's what gets him caught at the end of that play. We don't have that play. That would be my person. Some people put it as a third play. I don't see how that works. Then we have the Prometheus Bound, and then we have the Prometheus Unbound. In the Prometheus Unbound, presumably what happens is Zeus mellows in his position. He becomes a more even-tempered king, the way a king theoretically should be, while Prometheus realizes you have to have a strong leader, that you can't have basically people doing whatever they want. And so they end up coming to a middle ground, and then Prometheus is released. That seems to be the story arc. What we have is this middle part. It starts with Prometheus being chained, and it's pretty brutal. The chaining scene is pretty brutal in its description of the chaining. And then we've got Prometheus, after the people who chain him to the rock leave, he then goes into this long soliloquy about all the stuff that he did for humankind. And that he is bemoaning the fact that he now is stuck and can't get away in this awful situation. So my fifth point for this chapter, for chapter 5, is the scholarship. So the scholarship in chapter 3 comes from Wendy Doniger and her book, The Implied Spider. Wendy Doniger is a Hindologist. She's a study of Hinduism, and she is, of course, then a scholar of Sanskrit, which is an Indo-European language, and it is the oldest Indo-European language we have. Using Sanskrit and Greek especially, but also Latin, which would be the three oldest surviving Indo-European languages, it is possible to start to move backwards, because there are laws of how languages develop. And we have the laws that exist now, and we have older versions of those languages, right? We have like Old English, and we have Old German, and we have Old French. So we have these versions that are close to, much earlier versions. And so we can move back. We know what the rules are for language development, and we can sort of move our way back and then posit what Indo-European would have been like. So we can sort of theorize that the Indo-European word for father was blank, or the word for mother, or the word for tree, or the various things. right, that we can work our way back. And that's what the title of the book, The Implied Spider, refers to. If you have a spider web of all the languages that are connected, then you can work your way back and you can come up with the theory there must have been a spider that produced this web. And you can sort of get a rough idea of the spider based on the web itself, right? That's the idea. So now Doniger, how does that connect to myth? Doniger suggests that a more comparative way of looking at myth. Remember that Malinowski said you couldn't do that. That like the myths of the Trobriand Islanders make sense only within that context. Outside that context, they don't make sense. And you can't really do just a slapdash comparison. Doniger suggests that, in fact, you can because myths deal with the same key things, right? Loss, right? Death, right? It's something that's going to, every culture is going to have stories that deal with the question of we're going to die at some point, or we're going to lose someone close to us, and what's the grieving process and all that stuff. Every culture has stories about that. So therefore, because there is some common experience to us as humans, we can look at the stories that deal with those, and then we can do comparisons that way. And that's not a bad way of looking at it. Now, Doniger does say that some individual cultures are so sort of isolated that, in fact, their version of a common sort of story about dealing with death could be so unique, it could be framed in such a way that is so unique that it seems like it's not connected. And that sort of answers the problem that Malinowski has with the Trobriand Islanders, who would have been very isolated, and therefore there would have been very little interaction between them and the cultures around them. But even the Trobriand Islanders have stories about death and the inevitability of death and how do you deal with death, that sort of thing. So that largely covers the what's in chapter 3. The comparison piece is another selection from Genesis, this time dealing with the flood. The Greeks also have a flood narrative, as do the ancient Mesopotamians and other cultures as well. So the flood narrative is fairly common. Some people say that indicates that there was a real flood. I think it's highly unlikely that there was a flood such as we get described in Genesis, that basically sort of wipes out the world and covers it in water. But the Mesopotamians, right, they lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, both of which flood like the Nile River floods. And there could have been some bad floods there that would have killed lots of people. And so my guess is that out of Mesopotamia came the original flood narrative, which was an imaginative story. What if we've seen bad floods? What if something is 300 times worse than any of those? And then we get from that then travels all over the place, including to the ancient Jews, who then have their own flood narrative. Because let me tell you, ancient Greece, flooding is not a problem in ancient Greece or modern Greece. The rivers in Greece are almost dry in the summer. So in the winter, they're going to be quite a bit bigger, but they're still not going to be at a point where they're going to actually go over their banks. So there's no real flooding problem in Greece. So why do the Greeks have a flood narrative? Well, probably they borrowed it from one of these other cultures that they had dealings with. All right, so on to chapter 4 with the next lecture.